I'm moving right along. It's funny how, a half hour goes by so quickly when you have a lot to say. So I want to be mindful of our next teacher as well. So our next teacher is Rabbi Joshua Z. Heller. He has served as the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Torah since July 2004. Heller is acknowledged as an expert in Jewish law and practice, particularly in relation to technology. And we are learning from him a really interesting session, it looks like, entitled, Are We There Yet? So Rabbi Joshua Heller, please take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Happy Shavuot. Glad to be able to be with you out there in Zoom land. If you have ever had the experience of going on a road trip with young children, there is that point in the trip where the refrain is repeated. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And usually we have gotten out of the driveway when that starts, but not always. And I think for the last 15 months or so, we have been in this eternal dance of that. And I will say, knowing that we have an international audience here in the United States, we may not be there, but we are approaching it from a medical perspective. But different things are happening in different communities. And the question that I really want to wrestle with you is the question is, from an ethical perspective, how do we actually know that the pandemic is over? And, we all have different levels of comfort and desire in terms of having in-person activities. How do we know when Jewish ethics would say that a risk is acceptable for us? And also, a year ago, I was here on this Zoom talking about why it was that we were having this thing on Zoom in the first place, only a little bit meta. And the question is, so what happens to all of this incredible richness of new practice that has emerged as a response to the pandemic? Is this a one-off? Or if the initial criteria that prompted these innovations go away, do things go back to whatever it was? So those of us who remember February of 2020, things really happened very quickly. So February 29th, we were eating in restaurants, people were blowing out birthday candles. I don't know how we ever got away with that. That's like gross, eating a cake that other people have blown on. But anyway, and then in mid-March, we were talking about, okay, this is gonna be a short-term thing, so we'll have a minyan in one place and everyone else can watch via stream. And within a week, every single synagogue in the country in the United States was shut down, and in most countries around the world. And we were looking at something very different about really moving Jewish life online. There was the invention of the Zoom Seder. And by the high holidays, most congregations affiliated with the conservative movement were streaming. So I know I worked with Zoom to enable a Zoom to go for more than 24 hours through the high holidays. And we had about 300 communities. Interestingly, not all of them conservative or Masorti, who attached themselves to that. So there was a real interest in that. And if you look at the range within even our own movement, there are some communities where the strictures of halacha as classically defined may be interesting, but are not considered constrictive, and they're going to do what they feel comfortable doing. And there are definitely some communities that have managed to weather this pandemic without resorting to streaming on Shabbat or Yom Tov, but there's a vast majority, a middle, that is wrestling with how does this practice, has wrestled for the past year with how do we do this while remaining true to who we are as a community? And now have the follow-up question, which is, what happens when this is over? Oh, and by the way, when is this over? Getting into this was actually surprisingly straightforward. Getting out of it is actually a little bit more complicated. And so one of my colleagues actually called this process that we're in now the process of seeing if we can put the toothpaste back in the tube. Now, of course, the challenge is that the whole point of toothpaste is that eventually it does come out of the tube. You just don't want it to come out into your orange juice because that tastes gross. So as we think about narrow questions about streaming methods and different approaches to Shabbat, those questions are interesting, and the presentation that Rabbi Bardak gave us can give us some insight into some of that. I want to think about some really big picture, complicated conversations. What does this mean for the future where you have roomers, people in the room, and Zoomers, people online? And more to the point, what many communities are wrestling with right now, which is when is the right time to go back? So in March, when this all started and we were shutting things down, we were beginning to think about my son's bar mitzvah. And I actually joked, it'll be just our luck. The pandemic will end the week before his bar mitzvah. And so we took the money we were going to spend on Kiddush and a party and used it to fix up some things in the house. And it looks like this is the week when our synagogue's medical committee says, no, hundreds of people can come now. It's all good. So I could talk to you about the nitty gritty of streaming methods and so on, but I actually want to take us to a much bigger picture. I want to think about how we got here and how we know when it's over. And so we have a couple of slides, and I don't want to get too bogged down in every single text that I brought, but I want to point out that there are different criteria for when we bend the rules and different parameters that apply in each. So the first is called Sha'at Hadchak, which is known as Exigent Circumstances. So this is actually the first real slide. It's text A1 if you happen to have the PDF at home. And the story goes, I don't know if we have that slide or not, or if it's coming, we'll find out. Okay, excellent. And so this pair of sages got drunk at the wedding of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's son, and they fell asleep before reciting the evening Shema. This reminds me of much of my undergraduate experience. By the time they awoke, dawn had already passed, and they came before Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and asked him if they could still recite the evening Shema, oddly enough, also consonant with my undergraduate experience. And he said to them, Rabbi Shimon is worthy to rely upon b'sh'at hadchak, in exigent circumstances. Basically, when things get tough, when the going gets tough, the tough get praying, even though it's already basically dawn. So he allowed them to say the evening Shema, even though it was really too late according to every view, except for Rabbi Shimon, who was kind of an outlier. And that is actually a very important principle in Jewish law, the idea of Sha'at Hadchak, the idea that when you are stuck, you can read through the book and find an opinion that people don't usually follow, but that in this particular case works and gets you out of a jam. And so the thing about Sha'at Hadchak is it can be a major crisis. It can be, Rabbi Bardak talked about loss of money, financial crisis. She was talking about Chol HaMoed, days where the prohibition on work is not as serious. We're talking about Shabbat, where the prohibition on work is like a stoning offense. But nevertheless, that whether it is something as small as oversleeping for the Shema or something as big as a potential Shabbat violation, you can't just do whatever you want, but you can go fishing for a precedent that gets you out of your hole. And so that Sha'at Hadchak can be something relatively minor or something relatively major. It just has to be pressing. And it's a situation that can recur, right? The idea of oversleeping or falling asleep and missing saying the Shema is not a once in a lifetime experience. So Sha'at Hadchak is something that applies in multiple cases and something that you don't do all the time, but you can trot out when you get stuck, right? So a snowstorm might be Sha'at Hadchak, right? A power outage might be Sha'at Hadchak. Sha'at Hadchak is not every day, but we're stuck. What are our options? Something far more, but the key is that a Sha'at Hadchak is based on precedent. More dramatic is the idea of what's called a Hora'at Sha'ah, a temporary ruling. And so a classic example of a Hora'at Sha'ah will be found in the Haftorah that we read this Shabbat. Manoach, who is perhaps unintentionally one of the comic figures in the book of Judges, has an angel visit his wife and say, guess what? You are going to have a son. He is going to be Shimshon, the strong and brave. And you, Mrs. Manoach, he will be a Nazirite, and you should observe special restrictions while you are pregnant with him. And Manoach, being the comic foil, does not believe the angel and brings an offering even though you're not supposed to bring an offering outside the tabernacle. So it was a hora'at sha'ah, basically limited permission once off. And just because he did it that one time you don't get to rely on that as a future precedent. And so Maimonides, in his Rules of Heretics, by the way, if this is in the Rules of Heretics, you know that you're on dangerous ground if heresy is on the table when you're talking about this process. He says that the court has the power to suspend even those rules for a term, even if it is lesser than the earlier court. So by the way, just because those guys a generation ago were giants and we're just schlubs, we can still overrule them because we have the authority. Those rabbinic decrees must not be more rigorous than Torah law. Any court has the authority to suspend the law in an emergency. How so? A court that determines that to strengthen the law, religion, and to make offense so that the masses do not violate Torah law, has the authority to flog offenders without warrant authorized by positive law. But they do not establish this deflection from positive statute impermanence and do not declare that such is the law. And similarly, if the members of the court determine to nullify a positive commandment or to transgress a negative commandment in order to cause the masses to return to law religion or to prevent the majority of Israel from stumbling, the court does so, suspends the positive law. For just as the doctor amputates a limb or a foot in order that a patient survives, similarly the court rules at any time to transgress a few commandments for a term in order that the masses may one day return and fulfill all the commandments. So this is a much more powerful tool than Shatatach. Shatatach is a pocket knife. This is a chainsaw, right? You can actually cuts through anything, and it still goes through a tomato like this. That hora'at sha'ah really allows a court to do almost anything, and it doesn't have to be based on anything. But on the other hand, you also can't rely on it as a future precedent. You are really speaking about a one-off. So when we think about the use of Zoom and other technologies and streaming on Shabbat, a question that we can ask is this potentially a sha'at hadchak? Is this are we relying on minority opinions that we can trot out whenever it is necessary to do so? Or is it considered a hora'at sha'ah? Is this a one-timer because otherwise communities would have collapsed, but under normal circumstances, you can never get away with this sort of thing? And so one of the questions that rabbis are now debating is, where do streaming and some of these other things fall in? Are they consonant with what has been done before, or are they such a break that they only apply in a once-in-a-lifetime unique circumstance? There is a third category, which is sakana, danger. This is A3. And so if you think about A3, sakana, and this is actually one of my favorite sources on this, this is found in the Talmud tractate Eruvin, which deals with the rules of legal fictions. It is forbidden to carry things from one place to another on Shabbat. And Eruvin says that there's a way to make a legal fiction of that, which is basically put a string around what you are carrying, around the area, and then you can carry and transport within. Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident during a time of danger, sha'at sakana, when decrees were issued that banned religious observance. And we would carry a Torah scroll from courtyard to roof, from roof to courtyard, from courtyard to enclosure, to read from it. So there was something that was preventing the regular study of Torah, and carrying something from a roof to a courtyard and so on is not a violation of Torah law, but is a violation of rabbinic law. And so they enabled a prohibition, they undid a prohibition of rabbinic law because there was a danger preventing us from doing what we wanted to do. And however, when the sakana was over, that permission went away. So on the other hand, though, that's sakana for a whole community. On the other hand, sakana, danger, can also apply to an individual. So look at A4 with me. Because there's another definition of sakana, which is a little bit more circumscribed, and you don't have to have a worldwide crisis for it to apply. The sages of Nehardea say, For a woman in childbirth, there are halachic distinctions between 3, 7, and 30 days after she gives birth. The Gemara elaborates. In the first 3 days after birth, whether she said, I need Shabbat to be desecrated, or whether she did not say so, one desecrates Shabbat for her. So the first 3 days after a woman has given birth, whatever needs to be done for her health, the danger to her life is so significant that whether she wants it or not, doesn't matter if she asked for soup, you're making it. Doesn't matter if she needed warm water, you're heating it. Whatever it is that you feel is needed for her health is done without qualms. Between 3 and 7 days after birth, if she said, I need Shabbat to be desecrated, you desecrate it. If she didn't, then you don't. So we could actually have a conversation as moderns about sort of a paternalistic view. Don't we believe a woman to tell us what she needs or doesn't need? And I just want to wave at that point as we pass by it. But the idea is that starting between 3 and 7 days, it's subjective. Is there really a danger to life or not? And we trust the person to tell us. At the beginning, I don't care whether you think you're in danger, I think you're in danger, and that's enough for me. And then between 7 and 30 days after birth, even if she said, I need Shabbat to be desecrated, one does not desecrate Shabbat for her. However, we perform all necessary prohibited labors by means of a Gentile. So there comes a point where we recognize that there is a danger, but the danger is far enough away that we can take advantage of existing loopholes. We don't need to just burst willy-nilly, right? So if someone is so sick that we are afraid they're going to die, we just take him to the hospital, we don't ask questions, right? If someone has a mild level of illness, we think, well, gee, can we solve this in a way that minimizes the violations of Shabbat before we rush off and just go to the extreme? And so as we think about these texts, we can think about these as different levels of approaching the pandemic, right? There was a point perhaps where we said, I don't care whether you think you're in danger. We as a community, medical experts, rabbis, community leaders say that there is a danger for everyone and just do whatever you need to do. There's a point where you have to lean back and say, well, gee, if someone feels they're in danger, so be it. And there's a point where even if you think you're in danger, let's not go all out here because the risk really is objectively lower. And we see that there is that level of scaling back that happens in this text about sakana. And this ruling is in accordance with the statement of Rav Ula, son of Rav Leil, who said, all the needs of a sick person whose life is not in danger are performed by means of a Gentile on Shabbat. So if you are sick, but your life is not in danger, we can still violate Shabbat for you, but it is done through use of a non-Jew, right? Which is one of the ways to one of those loopholes. So if we think about where we are with Zooming and streaming, it is difficult, though not impossible, to Zoom and stream without any violations of Shabbat. The ways that are easiest, simplest, most crowd-pleasing tend to involve violations of Shabbat. And so in the midst of a pandemic, when walking into synagogue could be a life or death decision, you're not going to worry about the details about how something happens. When you're at a point where the risk is lower, just like the case of a woman who is now a week after childbirth, it's not that we're unconcerned, but we have to balance that concern for health and well-being against other values because that risk is lower. And so each individual community, rabbis, medical leaders, can use these texts to decide for their own community where they feel they are in this transition. And different communities might objectively be in different places. If you're in a place where everyone in a community is vaccinated and case numbers are low, or you are in a place in a country where vaccination is not widely available yet, your answers to these questions are going to be objectively different even before you get into the subjective question of how you feel about where you are. So the second question, though, is how do you know that the danger has passed? And this is, for me, really the most fascinating ethical question that I think all of us are grappling with, whether we realize it or not. How do you know that the pandemic is over and life can go back to whatever normal was? So if you look at text B1, there's the idea of something called Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the government is the law. So this is an idea, a concept that is found in a number of cases in the Talmud. Shmuel says the law of the kingdom is the law. Dina de Malchuta. Dina Rava said, know this, because the authorities cut down palm trees without the consent of their owners and construct bridges from them, and yet we cross those bridges. So this is a case where we literally will cross those bridges when we get to it. So even though these bridges are, we're going to go one more slide ahead. So, thank you. So even though these bridges are made in theory from wood that is stolen, that is confiscated illegally, the government has the right to say what it wants to say. Now, to be fair, in traditional texts, this normally refers only to matters of money, right? So the government's right to tax and levy duties or confiscate property. But in fact, we understand it in terms of other areas of law as well. So if the government says large meetings are prohibited, we don't try to have large meetings in secret. We're still on B1 right now. On the other hand, when you have an unjust government, we're going to go back one slide for just a minute. When you have an unjust government, an anti-Semitic government that is specifically trying to crack down on Jews, then Dina de Malchuta doesn't apply. In most communities where Jews live, those prohibitions seem to be applied fairly unevenly. However, so Dina Malchuta is applying is necessary but not sufficient, because there are places where the government has said, look, you're on your own. We don't want to have this go to the Supreme Court as a First Amendment matter, so you do what you do and leave us out of it. Now we're ready to go to B2. So another view is that any possible risk to life is too much. So this is found the Shulchan Aruch. This is in the laws of kosher. And so the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, says, similarly, he should be careful of all things that cause danger, because danger is stricter than transgression. So in other words, it is even worse to eat something dangerous than something that is not kosher. That is actually a greater restriction to risk your life than to not keep kosher. And they give a list of all sorts of kinds of foods that are dangerous, that would believe dangerous. And all these things are because of danger. And anyone who wants to guard his life must protect himself from them. The asur lismoch anes. You cannot rely on a miracle to get you out of it. And so one view is that anything that is in the least bit dangerous is prohibited, which basically means you are staying in your house forever. Right? Because there will always be some risk, right? Until coronavirus totally goes away, there will always be some risk. And we're going to go right ahead to B4. There's a flip side in the Talmud, which is the rabbis realized that just because something is dangerous or dumb doesn't mean people don't do it. This is the whole premise on which teenagers are based. So the Gemara explains, on the third day of the week, what is the reason one does not let blood? Because the planet Mars is dominant during the even hours. As all of us know, bloodletting is a very healthy practice, or at least it was at that time. And the best science of the day had something to do with astrology and when Mars was dominant, and Mars, as the bloody planet, made those terrible times to give blood. But on Shabbat Eve, Mars also dominates, and yet we allow people to have their blood let on the eve of Shabbat. And this was not because the Red Cross was around, but because it was actually viewed as therapeutic. Just like you might go get a massage or go to a chiropractor today, you'd have a good little bloodlet to get you feeling loose, feeling ready for Shabbat. So even though it was dangerous, they say, Kevan de dashu be rabim, shom raptim Adonai, because everyone does it, basically because everyone's doing it, it's okay. So this is literally, the Talmud said, if everyone else jumped off a bridge, you might as well also. But that basically, if everyone does it, then you might as well, and you consider, and the shomer p'ta'im Hashem, God protects the foolish. So this is another view in the other direction, which is, you know what, if everyone's doing it, you know what, like God will protect, right? So on the one hand, if it's the least bit dangerous, don't. The other view is, look, if people are doing it. If everyone else is eating in restaurants unvaccinated, you might as well, and what's the worst that could happen other than that you die? So you have these real two extremes. One is that any sakana is actually really serious, and in fact, we skipped a text that said that you should be given lashes if you take on something that's dangerous. And the other is if people are doing it, then go ahead and do it. My favorite answer to this is found in a response of Moshe ben Yosef Tirani. This is in the days of the Ottoman Empire. I'll just summarize it for you. It's the case of a husband or wife who wants to force their spouse to move to Israel, even though the journey is dangerous. And even if the Ottoman Empire is united empire, can I force someone to take the roads when there are robbers and lions and tigers and bears and who knows what? And the conclusion is that when all of the merchants do not refrain from traveling on the roads, a husband and wife can force each other to do so as well. In other words, that when the risk of doing something for a reasonable secular purpose is considered acceptable, then it becomes acceptable for a holy purpose, ascending to the land of Israel as well. So what I would propose to you is that we have a number of different criteria. Government permission, no matter what, it has to be totally safe. Who cares if people are doing it, it's fine. Or let's measure the risk against other risks we see as acceptable. I happen to like that last answer a little bit more because, you know, we live by a higher standard than Dino de Malchuta Dina. But the truth is we all take on risks every day to live life. So for example, 40,000 people a year die in the United States in car accidents, and we understand that that is a risk. You could say, well, everyone should walk to synagogue, and that would be nice. I have a friend who, unfortunately, his sister was actually run over on the way to synagogue. So nothing is 100% safe. On the other hand, during the pandemic, you had people saying, well, you know, it's no more dangerous than the flu. That has not been true, and I have 20 funerals to show for it in the last year. But there will come a day when that actually is true. So we had an incident in our preschool that, funny is the wrong word. We had a kid with a fever and sniffles, and people were panicked. Oh my God, is it COVID? And they took the kid that got the kid test. They're like, thank God it's the flu. Well, it turns out that if you are under the age of 5, the flu is actually probably more dangerous for you than COVID. So the celebration was a little premature. But certainly for the nerves of the community, flu is an answer people were happier to hear. Some closing points. There's a challenge here also of inclusion because there are people who will not be able to be vaccinated because of their age or medical conditions, or they have some sort of internet-induced stupidity that prevents them from getting vaccinated. Or there may be people who, even though they get vaccinated, it's not effective. And conversely, we know that there are people who, for whom technology on Shabbat is a bridge too far. And all the things that we do to make the people at home feel connected cause a disconnect with the people in the room. And so I think we are looking at, in the narrow sense, a question of when the transition is far enough that we can no longer say, you know what, it's a hora'at sha'ah. All bets are off, leave the precedents aside. We got to do this because we got to keep the community together. And when do we say life has come back to normal and we actually have to use the criteria of the way the law normally works, keeping in mind the needs of the community, keeping in mind precedent in order to figure out where we go next. So I wish all of our communities and everyone watching great success in trying to figure out how this actually works. Our law committee of the conservative movement is talking about this topic in the next few weeks. And I hope that the wisdom that we have to offer will be helpful to those who are wrestling with this in communities with different needs, facing different situations, facing individuals who have different needs as well. And I wish everyone a joyous Shavuot and next year with cheesecake.
Amen. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Hiller, thank you so much. I found that fascinating, and I think it also does, it really led really nicely from Rabbi Bardak's teaching into yours about this idea of communal responsibility, but also I think something to take note of in what you're teaching about is this idea that we should be careful of the danger in the world, be mindful of all the ways that harm could befall us, and think about, are those normal things or are those potential public catastrophes? And hopefully that will make the world generally a safer place in lots of ways when we do move back into more in-person gatherings. So thank you.
Thank you.
I am moving things right along. I know it's I said this before. For those also, if anyone's just joining since I started hosting, I am Rabbi Jenna Stein-Turo.